Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something really fascinating. We are going to impartially analyze the underlying themes of a recent broadcast of the late-night political comedy show, Gutfeld. Now, rather than just laughing at the jokes or, getting caught up in the partisan crossfire, we're going to completely break down the specific rhetorical strategies the panel uses to build a cohesive worldview. As you'll see, we'll look at exactly how they take wildly disparate news items, from prison policies all the way to celebrity gossip, and spin them into a highly structured narrative.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our thematic roadmap for today. First, we'll analyze late-night political comedy. Then we'll look at critiques of California governance, followed by media priorities and public perception. After that, we'll tackle political authenticity and credentials. And finally, personal responsibility and culture.
All right, Section 1, Analyzing Late-Night Political Comedy, decoding the underlying arguments behind the punchlines.
So late-night political comedy is a pretty unique beast. On the surface, sure, it just feels like rapid-fire segments designed strictly to get a laugh. But right beneath those punchlines, these shows are actually meticulously crafted to reinforce a unified, overarching worldview. Literally every joke, every panelist reaction, every chosen news clip, it's all a building block and a much larger argument about how society should operate. To pull this off effectively and fairly in our analysis today, we're going to use a technique called distance framing. Basically, this means we will objectively break down the panel's highly partisan critiques, examining their arguments, their evidence, and their comedic framing, without taking sides or endorsing the underlying viewpoints. We're just looking under the hood at the mechanics of the messaging.
Moving right along to Section 2, Critiques of California Governance, examining the panel's view on progressive policies.
Let's move to and see how this builds into their first major target, the panel's relentless mockery of California state governance. The broadcast dedicated a huge chunk of its time to highlighting progressive policies in California that they frame as misguided, dangerous, or just flat-out absurd. And the show zeroed in on a truly staggering figure: $189 million. The panel highlighted that California approved this massive sum of taxpayer money for a program to provide digital tablets to state inmates, and yes, that includes those on death row. The host and panelists essentially used this figure to anchor their argument that the state is wildly mismanaging its resources, arguing that California is prioritizing the comfort of violent criminals over the safety and financial well-being of everyday law-abiding citizens.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the specific bureaucratic jargon the panel ruthlessly mocked. They pulled this exact phrase used by the administration to justify the tablet program. By highlighting terms like digital equity and justice-impacted criminals, the show's host argued that policymakers are using sanitized, progressive language to completely mask the grim reality of who these devices are actually going to, which in their view are convicted murderers. It is a classic comedic technique, right? You contrast lofty, academic, bureaucratic language with stark reality to generate outrage and, of course, laughter.
To really cement their critique of this program, the show cited allegations from commentator Christopher Rufo. The panel reported his claims that inmates were easily bypassing the tablet's internet restrictions. According to the segment, this allowed death row inmates to access illicit pornography and, probably the most alarming allegation presented, contact and actually harass victims on the outside. So the panel used these specific claims to frame the program not just as a monumental financial waste, but as a dangerous failure that actively harms the public.
From there, the broadcast smoothly pivoted to another California policy to hammer their theme home. They targeted Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass and her proposal for comprehensive health care, specifically focusing on her argument for providing free dental care for recovering meth addicts. They took her earnest quote, that you can't succeed at a job without teeth, and used it as the primary setup for their punchlines. The panel basically argued that providing cosmetic dental repair completely ignores the actual root cause of the problem, which is the drug addiction itself.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core tension the show relies on. They constantly juxtapose the stated goals of progressive policies, things like digital equity or compassion for addicts, against what the panel views as absolutely absurd downstream outcomes. In their worldview, these policies represent a complete abandonment of common sense, prioritizing cosmetic fixes and criminal comfort while entirely ignoring the root causes of addiction or the rights of crime victims.
Let's head to Section 3, Media Priorities and Public Perception, analyzing the show's critique of mainstream focus.
Having established their critique of the policies themselves, the broadcast transitioned to how the media actually covers those policies. The panel actively argued that mainstream entertainment and news media purposefully manipulate public perception. How? By focusing on trivial details while completely ignoring systemic failures. To make this point, they analyzed a TMZ interview with Los Angeles mayoral candidate Spencer Pratt. The panel contrasted what TMZ chose to investigate with what they believe the real story actually was. TMZ aggressively questioned whether Pratt actually slept in the mobile trailer featured in his campaign ad, or if he was secretly staying in a fancy hotel. The panel, however, expressed complete outrage that TMZ ignored why Pratt was without a home in the first place, which was because his house burned down. They used this specific example to argue that the media obsesses over symbolic gotcha moments to protect incumbent politicians, while actively ignoring severe, systemic issues like crime, public safety, and homelessness.
Moving to Section 4, Political Authenticity and Credentials. The case of Abdul El Sayed.
This whole discussion of media misdirection served as a perfect bridge into another recurring theme for the panel, attacking the authenticity and credentials of Democratic politicians. The show dedicated a segment to arguing that progressive figures often hide behind unearned authority to push their agendas. Their prime example here was Michigan Democratic Senate candidate Abdul El Sayed. Now, the panel fully acknowledged his undeniably impressive academic background. I mean, a medical degree from Columbia and a doctorate from Oxford is nothing to sneeze at. However, the show's critique centered entirely on the fact that El Sayed has never actually held a legal medical license to practice, yet he frequently refers to his experiences seeing medical codes and uses the title of doctor in his political messaging. The panel framed this as a deceptive inflation of his credentials.
So, the crucial point is how the panelists blended this credential scandal with their bigger political complaints. Panelist Tyrus delivered this wildly satirical quote claiming undocumented doctors have the same rights as documented doctors. It is a very specific, very clever rhetorical move. By using the word undocumented, a term heavily associated with progressive immigration policy, he successfully blended the critique of the candidate's medical credentials with a much broader partisan jab at Democratic policies, essentially mocking both of them simultaneously.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Personal Responsibility and Culture, unpacking the great American fund deficit. For this final section of our explainer, we're looking at how the broadcast pivoted from hard politics straight into cultural commentary. Because ultimately, everything on this show ties back to their underlying views on personal responsibility. They explored this through a seemingly lighthearted segment about a recent survey on fun. The show presented a statistic indicating that 48%, so nearly half of all American adults, feel their overall life is lacking fun. Now, while a mainstream news show might use a stat like that to discuss mental health or, work-life balance, this panel used it as a jumping-off point to critique modern cultural attitudes toward entitlement and effort. The panelists offered a really fascinating philosophical pushback to the survey. They strongly argued against the modern mentality that constant fun is just an expected baseline of adulthood. Instead, panelists like Tyrus argued that fun is the extra you get when you succeed. It is a reward strictly reserved for after you have completed your hard work and met your responsibilities. Other panelists, like Joe DeVito and the host, chimed in to add that as you age, the desire for fun is naturally and rightfully replaced by a desire for peace, calm, and serenity. It was a very clear articulation of a traditionalist worldview regarding duty and maturity.
So when we pull all the way back, we can see the exact step-by-step comedic formula this broadcast utilizes. Step 1. They identify an extreme progressive policy, maybe a bureaucratic buzzword or a cultural trend. Step 2. They highlight a contradictory, hypocritical, or completely absurd downstream outcome of that trend. In Step 3, they ruthlessly mock the subject to validate a conservative worldview centered entirely on common sense and personal responsibility. It is a highly structured, highly effective method for building a compelling narrative from what might seem like just random daily news items.
Which leads us with a really vital question to ponder. As the lines between news, entertainment, and comedy continue to blur more every day, how does this blending impact the way audiences digest complex civic issues? When incredibly severe topics like prison reform, addiction, and public safety are filtered through a highly structured comedic lens designed specifically to reinforce a certain worldview, what happens to our broader civic dialogue? It's absolutely something every informed viewer should keep in mind the next time they tune in. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.